You are listening to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and today we have the high honor of hearing from Victoria Zimmerman. Abuse often involves intensity, whether it's sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse. The nature of abuse is that there is an intensity between the two people involved. When a parent abuses a child, the intensity at play serves to bind their hearts together. Today, Victoria shares a trauma story that illustrates how her heart was bound to her abuser and how she has come to be released and find new levels of freedom. Victoria also talks about how she has come to bless her longing as a child and as an adult for her father's gaze, even though the price of that gaze was abuse. Thank you so much for listening. Here is my very meaningful conversation with Victoria. I am here with Victoria Zimmerman. Victoria, it's good to see you.
Hi, it's good to see you, Adam.
Tell our listeners a little about where you are living and what you spend your time doing.
Sure. I live in Dallas, Texas. I spend my time working as a fellow at the Allender Center. So I get the honor and the privilege of sitting with folks and getting to hear their stories and imagine with them. And I also run a surrogacy agency called Aspen Surrogacy Group, where we offer holistic care to our surrogates. And so I spend a lot of time running that business. I created the business, so it's my baby right now.
Let's talk story. How did you find out that you had a story? How did you start to engage your story?
I was living in Colorado at the time, and I had just landed my dream job. I was in my early 20s, and I was the director of a pregnancy center. And I had gone to school for youth ministry and had wanted to work in the nonprofit sector, working with young moms. And so this was exactly what I wanted to be doing. And I was running the center for about 8 or 9 months when I started recognizing that a lot of the stories of the women who would come through our doors were similar to stories of my own, to things that I had experienced before. And I had never put those stories in the category of harm in my own life, but I was recognizing the harm in the lives of these women. And so through that process of beginning to recognize where harm had been done in my own life, in my own stories, I realized that there was some things that needed to be engaged. And at the time, I had an incredible clinical director who was able to point me towards a book called The Wounded Heart by Dan Allender. And I read through it in a night. It felt like it was making sense of my life. And so that was sort of the beginning of me realizing that I had important stories to engage and things to process in my life.
So you read through The Wounded Heart in a night. That tells us eons about you.
I'd come home from work that day with this book, and at the time thought, this is ridiculous. I don't need to read this book. And I was renting a room in a home of a family I went to church with. And I remember walking into the kitchen and saying to the wife and the mom, "Oh, can you believe that someone gave me this book? This is ridiculous." And she looked at me with just such kindness in her face and in her voice and said, "Oh, Victoria, maybe you should go read it." So I stomped off to my room like a child and slammed the door to go read this book. And then, of course, couldn't put it down.
Any sense of why you couldn't put it down?
Yeah, I had felt like a lot of my experiences as a child were weird or crazy are the words that I would have put to them. And reading The Wounded Heart suddenly gave me context for a lot of my experiences. And so I felt like it was making sense of what had been happening for me internally in my thoughts, in my emotions, that made sense of my experiences as a child.
Yeah, I had a similar experience reading it. The way I described it is, as I was reading this book, it described the landscape of my heart better than anything I had ever read. So you spend your evening and into the night reading The Wounded Heart, and that propels you into what next?
So I went back to work the next day, and the woman who I worked with, her name was Jan, and I adore her. And so I said, "Jan, I read the book." She What? And I said, yeah, I stayed up all night and I read the book. And she said, okay, well, look on the back. The author, he has some like workshops and some things that he does. Why don't you try to contact him? And I was like, okay, that's a great next step. And so I did some research and signed up for a recovery week. And through some really generous offers of people at my church, was able to go and afford that week experience. And I came home after this week-long experience destroyed. I thought that I was going to be like, hey, I've got some trauma. I've got some things I need to work through. I'm beginning to recognize that there's sexual abuse in my past and I want to deal with it. And so I had talked to my mom and my sister and my dad, who was the abuser in my story, and had confronted him. And then went to this recovery week and thought, okay, I've taken all these steps. I'm going to go and tie a bow on this. I'm done. I've done the work. And that was a beautiful, hopeful thing to want and to desire. And it is certainly not what happened. I left that week feeling just completely undone. The story was so much bigger than I had recognized and realized, and had such a bigger impact on who I am and who I have been in the world. And so I came home and realized I need to be in therapy. But at the time I was living in Aspen, Colorado, and it's, a town of 6,000 people. So there's not a lot of options for therapists, particularly if you want to see someone who has at least a few degrees of separation from you. So I did some research, and one of the women who was a therapist at the recovery week I was at happened to live in Dallas, Texas. And the business that I was running at the time, I was a newborn care specialist. And so I was working with families in the Valley, and a lot of them have second homes in Dallas. So I already had some connections there with clients, and I thought, I'm just going to move. So I spent about 3 months with this therapist virtually, meeting with her over the phone through the summer. And then that fall decided to move to Dallas, to move and expand my business, and to really make a move that said, the most important thing right now is that I really need to be in therapy, and I need help and I need support. And I couldn't do that where I was living. So I moved to Texas.
You took your story so seriously.
Yeah, I don't know that I couldn't have at that point. Mm-hmm. I think once I began to acknowledge what was true, it was so pervasive in my life that I would have had to really bury a lot of who I was to not take the story seriously.
And so as you're in Texas, continuing to look at your story, doing therapy, what obstacles, what stuff got in the way? What was hard about continuing to engage your story?
Yeah. Oh, gosh, that's a great question. I think trying to engage stories of harm, of heartache, of brokenness on your own is always difficult, right? And so I was living in a state by myself where I didn't have family. I didn't know anyone. I started to make friends once I moved, but I didn't have any friendships when I moved to Texas. And so it was really, really lonely, which felt scary. There were a lot of days where I didn't want to engage story because it felt like, oh, I'm inviting all of these memories of darkness, all of these stories that were really heartbreaking into a space where I felt really alone. And so trying to make the priority be, what does it mean for me to just take care of myself? For someone who typically has the expectation of herself to be constantly doing the best in everything in life. So really hard. I had to sort of take a step back and say, the other areas of my life are going to have to suffer a little bit in order for me to focus on this one particular part. And so I continued to work and do my job and did it well, but I certainly wasn't growing my business the way that I otherwise would have been. I wasn't engaged in the community in the way that I otherwise would have been. I wasn't volunteering, right? There were a lot of things that had to go by the wayside, and that, particularly for my personality, was really difficult.
You were tending to your heart. You were tending to your body.
And I had been taught my whole life that that was the least important of the things that we should be tending to. And so that was incredibly difficult.
Mm-hmm. Well, you have graciously agreed to read one of your stories. It's a story of you as a 5-year-old girl. Would you be willing to read it now?
Yes, I would love to. It would be an honor. I was 5 years old, small, feisty, and a lover of laughter. My sister was 8 and my best friend. In the basement of our split level house, we were playing at my dad's big wooden desk, something we knew we weren't supposed to do. His desk was littered with envelopes and invoices and a Rolodex of mysterious numbers that we would flip through as we giggled and pretended to call who we imagined were very important people with mysterious jobs. At his desk was an orange upholstered office chair that swiveled. Spinning in it was one of my favorite things. My sister and I would push the chair across the brown shag carpeting and out into the middle of the room, where I'd climb into its cozy seat and curl up with my knees to my chest. My sister would stand next to me and spin the chair around and around. It seemed to get faster and faster with each rotation, and I'd sink down into its soft orange interior as it spun, grab the armrests, and throw my head back so my blonde hair was hanging over the side. And I would laugh like only a 5-year-old little girl can laugh. My laughter was so deep that day that I didn't hear what my sister must have heard clearly. Within a flash of a second, the chair began to slow. I couldn't feel the power of her spinning me anymore, and through my dizzy eyes, I was no longer catching glimpses of her as I went around. All at once, the chair stopped, and my dad was there, standing over me. He seemed like a giant to me. He was well over 6 feet tall, a Marine, tanned and calloused from spending his days working in the sun, built strong and thick like a football player. My eyes grew, my breathing stopped, and I tried to focus. The sudden feeling that I was about to throw up came with the realization that I was feeling an incredibly awful mix of dizziness and terror. My gaze darted around the room, trying to make sense of where my sister had gone and how my dad had replaced her so quickly. When I finally saw her, she was crouched under his desk, her own little body rolled up in a ball. She heard him come home and knew we'd be in trouble. She had no choice but to leave me spinning and save herself. He didn't say a word. I could feel his thick, strong fingers wrap around my arms, pressing deep into my skin. In one swift movement, he lifted me up, holding me out in front of him, staring at me with eyes full of rage. He took a step, and my sister unfurled herself just enough to yell out, "Daddy, no!" He didn't even turn and look at her. My body hung in the damp air, and I felt unable to breathe. My lungs were not taking in any more oxygen. 3 more steps, and we were at the edge of the room. With my body dangling, he pinned me to the wall, my face directly in front of his, and in a quiet, measured voice, he said, "Make my day." He was taunting me, begging me with his stare to fight, to kick, to scream, to beg him to stop. I stared back into his eyes with the most defiant look I could muster. He squeezed me tighter and tighter and pushed me harder up against the wall. My whole body was shaking in pain. His breath and his gaze were steady. I refused to look and willed myself not to cry for as long as I could. Finally, one soft tear slipped from my blurry eyes, and the second he saw it roll down my cheek, his grip loosened, and I crumpled to the floor, gasping for air. Without a word, he turned and walked away, his work boots leaving imprints in the carpet, like the bruises his fingers would leave on my arms. This was the beginning. Again and again, he would test my will, see how strong and how silent I could be. He needed to know how long I could endure pain without giving into it.
Thank you, Victoria. Can we go back through it and reflect on it together?
Yes.
Before we move into the dark part of the story, I want to pause for a bit and consider like the imaginative playfulness of this little girl. There's that part at the beginning where you say that his desk is littered with envelopes and invoices. There's this Rolodex that it's got all these mysterious numbers. and you and your sister are kind of flipping through it and giggling and pretending to call all these important people with mysterious jobs. Like you're 5 years old in this imaginative world of play.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's just a picture of a delightful girl and her sister having fun, like making up something fun.
I feel delighted as I think about it, like remembering what it was like to be this little girl that I had such a vivid imagination and loved to play pretend. It was my favorite thing. And so I can only just imagine with my sister in particular, right, getting to like pretend that we were the ones working and we're at dad's desk, and oh, so delightful.
Yeah. And I assume it's safe to say that by the age of 5, you would have known to fear your father.
Oh, absolutely.
So, given that, you write this sentence that in the basement of our split level house, we were both playing at my dad's big wooden desk, something we knew we weren't supposed to do. How do you understand why this girl is doing something she knows she shouldn't do when she's already scared of her father?
Oh, I was a girl who was so good at doing what she knew she wasn't meant to do. It's actually more surprising that my sister was willing to engage with me in something that we weren't meant to do. My sister is, or was at least as a child, much more of a rule follower. And so I'm sure that I had somehow kind of roped her into playing this game with me. I was a lot more risky in my play than she was. And so there was almost a sense of excitement that we were doing something we weren't meant to do.
Mm-hmm. And that's important to name because when we do story work, we have to remember the age of the kid in the story. Like you're a 5-year-old girl. You're not even in kindergarten yet. And we have to know something about who is this girl in this story. And the girl in this story at the very beginning is breaking the rules. And she knows there are consequences for that potentially. Like she's afraid of her father. She's not oblivious to that. She's risking. She's doing something defiant. And as you're putting words to now, that was part of who you were as a 5-year-old girl.
Yes, absolutely. There are lots of stories in my family that predate even this story of ways that the language my family would use was that I was stubborn or that I was strong willed, but ways that I would engage to say, just give it to me.
Yeah.
I'm going to do what I want to do, and I'm going to let the chips fall where they may. And if I have to stand in the corner for 3 hours, that's fine.
So even before we get to the end of the story where your defiance is basically at a crescendo, we know that this is a defiant girl.
Yes. Yeah.
And spinning wildly in that chair, you are laughing with sheer delight. Like your 5-year-old body is in a state of just joy.
Yes, absolutely.
Oftentimes, evil will introduce trauma at a moment when we are either at rest or filled with delight.
Mm-hmm.
And spinning in this chair, you're filled with delight. You're feeling joy.
Yeah.
And then within a fraction of a second, everything changes.
Mm-hmm.
What do you imagine that drastic bodily shift was like for that 5-year-old girl?
Just feel in my body the tightening, right? That in the spinning, there's such a sense of almost your body falling through the air, right? Such an openness in your body. And I can feel as I watch him come near me, right? I can feel my body restrict and tighten up, and I can feel my breathing stop. And I think that feels to me like the biggest sensation is the feeling of no longer breathing.
Yeah. So your nervous system is having a massive reaction to how your environment has just changed from a place of rest to a place of terror.
Yes, absolutely.
And we have to remember, again, you're 5 and your father he's a Marine, built strong and thick, and you are a tiny 5-year-old girl. And when we're doing story work, it's easy to see the boy or girl in the story through the eyes of an adult. And so I want to have the childlike eyes of this 5-year-old girl in mind. The terror starts. Your father, in your words, he didn't say a word. He grabs your arms with his strong fingers, he digs them into your skin, and then he is holding you out in front of him at eye level.
Yeah.
He doesn't throw you across the room.
Oh, no.
He doesn't hit you.
Mm-mm.
He could have done any number of things to inflict massive physical harm on that 5-year-old girl, but he restricts his physical violence to digging his fingers into your arm.
Mhm.
Any sense of why he restricted his physical violence?
Yes. I think he wants to be challenged. He wants the challenge. And so the restriction of physical violence for him is part of his arousal structure, right? That he is holding that in the challenge.
So, what do you mean when you say arousal structure?
For my dad in particular, for this abuser, the abuse is about power and about control. And the reason that my dad wants power and control is because it's arousing to him. It brings him to a moment where he can climax and release.
Yeah.
And for him and I in this interaction, right, he wants this struggle and this tension is building. And so if he were to have used all of his physicality at the beginning of this interaction, there would be no building. And that's what brings the terror. That's what brings the fear. And ultimately, that's what brings the contempt and the shame. And that's what he wants.
Yeah, and let's be clear that the intensity that he wants is a relational intensity with you.
Yes.
And part of what we mean when we talk about arousal structures is that it is a relational intensity between two people, often a parent and a child, that is inherently binding of the child to the parent's heart.
Mm-hmm.
That's what intensity does for us. Whether it's sexual intensity, violent intensity, intensity binds us very often to another person. And your father, he has eyes only for you in this story. He's not interested in your sister. He doesn't even care that your 8-year-old sister is telling him, a Marine, what to do. She's yelling out, "Daddy, no." He's not even going to address her. His eyes are for you.
Yes. Yeah. And knowing also the risk my sister took in that moment to yell out at him, right? And that it does, I mean, he doesn't even flinch. He is not the least bit concerned with a scenario where he might otherwise, she might have gotten the shit beat out of her, right? For even defying him and saying that. And yet in this moment, he's not interested.
Right. And the reason he's not is because he is very focused on the eyes of this 5-year-old girl, on the face of this 5-year-old girl. And as you write in your story, with my body dangling, he pinned me to the wall, my face directly in front of his. What is it like for that 5-year-old girl to be eye to eye with her father as she's pinned against the wall?
I think it's terrifying. There's also an energy that comes from the match, right? That there's something that he is not the only one that is building in intensity. There's also something for that little girl. With my sister in that same scenario, she may have likely began to cry immediately. She would have been very scared and very upset. And although I felt the terror, I also felt the intensity of what it meant to be in a match with him, that he chose me and he was engaged with me. And I had his gaze, even if it was one of terror for me.
And those are such important words. He chose you.
Mm-hmm.
And even though that was a violent choosing, it was attention and it was connection and it was intense connection.
Yes.
And that's what we mean when we talk about arousal structures. There is an intensity in your body and there is an intensity in his body, and you guys are eye to eye. You are eye to eye with a 6 foot plus hulking Marine.
Yes.
And you are not begging him to stop, and you are not yet crying,
Right.
which means he has met his match.
Yes.
The dilemma is that that's actually what he wants. Because the next part of the story is, I mean, the haunting words, make my day.
Mhm.
Do you know what he meant when he said that?
It's a phrase that he used often, always certainly as a challenge. And typically he would use it in the context of not talking back to him. He would give a challenge, and if you were to respond, there would be hell to pay. And so in that phrase, make my day, there was a sense of, if you want to cry, if you want to scream, if you want to kick, all you're doing is giving me a fight, and that's what I want. And so the make my day was a challenge to fight him.
Which is why he chose you instead of your sister.
Absolutely, 100%. Yes.
In your story, after he says, make my day, you write, I stared back into his eyes with the most defiant look I could muster. How do you understand? And again, we have to remember that you're a 5-year-old girl with a 5-year-old brain and a 5-year-old body. You are not Victoria now. You're not an adult. How do you understand why this 5-year-old girl looked directly at the towering Marine in front of her and brought eyes of defiance?
Yeah. Because I have a heart and a will and a spirit that says, you can't break me. I think even as a little girl, there was such a strength of who I was that said, I will be strong. And so I think that defiance was, even in my little 5-year-old heart, was to say, no, you cannot break me. I will engage with you and I will stare you down. And I grew up in a Christian home where we went to church and went to Sunday school. And I can only imagine that the story of David and Goliath played in my head often, that there was a sense of, I will be David. And David was strong.
What do you think now of that girl's decision to bring eyes of defiance?
There was a long gap in years where I was really self-contemptuous towards those eyes of defiance, that felt like I was giving myself a death sentence. I could have responded more in line with how my sister might have responded, which would have been to cry, which would have been to go limp, which would have been to not give him a fight. I've spent a lot of time as an adult being contemptuous towards that little girl and feeling like this was your fault, right? Like, why did you choose to respond the way you did? He chose you because of how you responded to him. I think after lots of work with two very kind, loving therapists who I still love dearly and feel just so incredibly, I think, privileged to have gotten to sit with, that I have come to realize that, like, I love the heart of that little girl. I can bless and honor the parts of me that he chose to use for evil, because they are good and they are part of the reflection of God and who I am.
And it's sweet. It's sweet to hear you say that. Those are hard fought for words that you just spoke.
Yeah, I think I feel the most emotion in talking with you about that, because it feels like it has been hard fought to come to a place of saying, I will bless that part of me. And it is not bad. It was used for evil, but it is good. And it is a good part of who I am.
The tear fell. Eventually, the pain, the intensity, a tear forms in your eyes, and then it rolls down your cheek. What was it like for you when the tear started rolling down your cheek?
Oh, I can remember the feeling of utter failure. I lost his gaze in that moment. The tear fell, and I felt like, oh, I'm not strong enough. I
Mhm.
couldn't do it. I couldn't sustain it. And what that meant was that it was over. It was just, he just let go. It was done.
You said a really important phrase. You lost his gaze. It's not just a phrase, it's what happened. When the tear falls, you lose his gaze.
Yeah.
And that's, if I'm hearing you right, that's devastating for your heart.
Devastating. Yes. I think in that moment, what I really want as I look back is to think, oh, she must have felt such relief. There must have been such a sense of, oh, you can breathe now, right? Even to that sense of breath. And yet that's not what I felt. It wasn't relief. It was despair. It was desperation. It was torture that I lost his gaze.
Right. And any sense of why you did at that moment? Why did you lose his gaze once the tear falls down your face?
Oh, because the battle's over for him. He has both won and lost in that moment, and the battle is done. There's no tension left any longer. He has no desire to tend to me or to care for me. So the moment that there's a tear is the moment that I show weakness, and he will not battle with someone who's weak.
Right. Which puts you in a superb bind. You can't have your father's gaze and have your heart intact.
Yeah.
And you weren't willing to compromise the second.
Right. I was a child of integrity, thankfully, but it put me in a bind.
This man is bent on your humiliation.
Yeah.
He knows you well enough to know that you're trying with all your might not to cry.
Yes.
It just needs to be said that this is, in my mind, this is the category of evil. Evil, there's a difference between wickedness and evil. Evil is bent on humiliation. It's bent on destroying the heart, not the physical body. This entire scene, and was it physical abuse? Absolutely. But that's not the core of the trauma for you.
Right. Right.
There is something happening between the two of you that is humiliating to you. And what was that like for you? And any sense of why your father needed to do that?
I can recall the feeling after I crumpled to the ground and he walks away of resolution, the feeling of next time I'll be stronger.
Right.
And so there was this feeling of you have to start hiding your tenderness better. Like you have got to get that out of here. Like it's not working for you.
And thankfully, you sucked at that.
At
Hiding your tenderness, killing your tenderness.
right.
Like you would not go that far as desperately as you wanted his gaze, which you only got with the elimination of anything perceived as weakness. As desperately as you wanted that, you wouldn't compromise the sensitivity of that girl. Not fully, not completely.
And I think that is, for me, is the bind of living into who God has created me to be, right? That there is this sense of I have incredible strength and determination, and I also have incredible tenderness. And so having to bear those together in the presence of a man who wants to destroy and whose love I desperately want.
Yeah.
Like it's not only that he wants to destroy, it's that he's my dad and I love him.
Yes. And I just want to emphasize this and underline it and highlight it and italicize it and bold it and everything else, because so often we are at war with ourselves because we deep down know that we wanted the gaze of our abusers. And right now, your face and your tone of voice is not contemptuous of that desire. You're at rest with that desire. You're blessing that desire. How did you come to that place, Victoria?
Oh, that's a great question. Uh, Slowly, I don't think I can say enough about the therapeutic relationships that I've had as a client. I've worked with two different therapists who both were trained through the Allender Center and really with a modality that I think has taught them to have to attend to the hearts of their clients in a way that has to name the harm and the goodness. And so I think it's when I can do both of those things in an environment in a safe therapeutic space where I feel the love and the care of someone else, that I was able to come to a place of saying, like, yeah, of course I bless that. Because, I know a lot of 5-year-olds, and guess what? They all love their dads.
And they want, and I love your language, they want their father's gaze.
Absolutely. I think now, as a 36-year-old woman who endured a decade plus of sexual abuse as a child at the hands of her father and other men, there still is a place in my heart that longs for my dad, and not only for a dad, but for mine.
Yes.
That says, this man is evil and has harmed me beyond understanding. And there are moments when all I want is for him to see me still.
Yes. And there is such glory in you being able to say that, because we are created in the image of a relational God, and there is no relationship that is dearer to the heart of a child than the parental relationship. It's just how we are built. And so we are often in binds as children between the desire to avoid the harm, the terror, the abuse of a parent, and the deep desire for their gaze and their love and their delight and their connection and their attention. And when the only way we get their attention is through violence, we'll take it.
Yes. Yep.
And then we will have a lifetime of self-contempt about our bodily knowledge that something inside us wanted the gaze,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe even provoked it in some ways, so that we would have some measure of connection.
As a really good abuser, which my dad was, he was very good at moments after abuse and after harm of offering me tenderness and care. We don't see that in this particular story,
Right.
but that continues throughout, right? And so as that's offered, right, then those are the places where I want to turn against my own heart now as an adult to say, why did I let him offer me that? Why did I accept that care and that tenderness? I must be complicit. This must have been my fault. And so I think having to go back and untie those binds, untie the ties, the connections, right, where I feel and felt complicit, and recognizing that a little girl wanting her father's gaze is not a child who is asking to be abused.
Any sense of how this story has shaped you? How it shaped you as a 6-year-old, a 7-year-old, a 20-year-old?
I think for a long time, it shaped me by showing me how much I needed to hide those parts of myself that were strong, that was a part of me that I thought only caused harm, as well as growing up in an environment where I was taught that women in particular are meant to be quiet and small and helpers, that was our role as women, that my job was to grow up and be the helper of a man. And so feeling as though my heart was bad, that who I was created to be, the strength that I had to somehow get rid of it and bury it and hide it, because it didn't fit in with the mold of who I was told I was meant to be. And so I spent a lot of time as a teenager and in my early to mid 20s working really hard to be somebody different, somebody who could be quiet and small and just help. What if I was just a helper? And it wasn't until my late 20s, my early 30s, that I began to recognize the goodness in this story in particular. And this story, I think, holds so much for me because it's such a story of my defiance and of my strength. And the first time that I can remember that defiance and that strength being used by my dad. And so this feels like the beginning of where I turned against my own strength. And so I think now in this stage of my life, being able to go back and say, oh, I need to bless that because that is good. And what does it mean for me now then, if I can look back and bless this part of me, that now as a 36-year-old, I can say, where are the places that I get to be strong and big, that I don't need to be small and I don't need to be quiet. And I can both be someone who helps as a helper and someone who leads. I'm someone who says, I will own all of who I am. And that includes that God has created me as someone who can stand against the harm of others. And the way that I could stand against my dad in this story while allowing my heart to stay soft and to desire his gaze is really like who I want to be as an adult, right? If I can channel that 5-year-old and say, oh, I can be strong and stand against evil and my heart can still be tender, that feels glorious.
Amen. All I can say is amen. Thank you, Victoria. This has been a bit of a whirlwind, and you have put language to some crucial categories when it comes to healing from trauma today. So thank you not only for that, but more importantly, just thank you for your vulnerability in sharing this story with us.
Yeah. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you for listening. If you want to receive episodes as soon as they are released, remember that you need to download the Place We Find Ourselves app from the App Store. And then you need to head over to my website and subscribe for $3 per month, $30 per year, so that you can get episodes immediately. All episodes become free 4 weeks after they are released. Have a great couple of weeks, everybody.